Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. If you like the content that you see, don't forget to like. And of course, any of that love, comment, suggestions, all those other wonderful things, there's that comment section down there as well. We have just finished up all the Saskatchewan ghost stories for the Ghostly Echoes series. So once again, we are moving further east in Canada and we are starting into Manitoba ghost stories. I hope you guys enjoy the next couple of spooky tales. Shared accommodation. When I asked, how do you go about collecting ghost stories, I never quite know how to reply. Often people have had ghost stories in their family heritage for years, and are only too happy to share them with me for others to enjoy. Archival newspapers are another cache. Today, paranormal events are not often reported in our daily newspapers, but years ago, supernatural occurrences might well have made the front page. Those stories were obviously extremely easy to locate. Simply talking to people, letting them know about my project, was another. Occasionally successful research method, and the method by which I came to hear the following intriguing story. After enjoying a 20-minute conversation with a journalist in Thompson, I came away not only with the information I'd been after initially, but also with a lead on a haunted house story in a town situated in another southeast of the province, many miles from Thompson. When I contacted the woman who had owned the house, she agreed to share her story for publication in the book, only on a promise of complete anonymity. This haunted house story was far too good to miss, so I readily agreed to her request. The name of the town was purposely been omitted, and the woman I spoke with shall be identified only as Shirley. Shirley had sold the property and had gone on to new challenges. She was relating events that had occurred in a place that now belongs to someone else, and so was legitimately reluctant to make any comments that might affect that person's life. Besides, she added hopefully, the house might well have become phantom-free by now. From the cautious way Shirley couched her phrases, it seemed that she was trying very hard to be a skeptic in the face of what amounted to almost certain proof of the existence of spirits. We weren't the only ones who sensed it. People would come to visit us and they'd say, "I'm not going into that room," she began. After a while, you get so you're spooking yourself crazy. Having set her disclaimers as firmly in place as she could, Shirley began to relate the history of her family's involvement with the haunted house. We bought the place in September 1994, but didn't move in until the following April, she explained. This interval gave the family time to make the necessary renovations to the house, and it also gave Shirley a chance to research the home's unusual history. It seems the young couple had bought the place during the Depression in the 1930s. It's safe to assume from the events as they unfolded that having the house and raising a family there were cherished dreams for these people. Sadly, they were only able to realize one of those dreams. When the woman became pregnant, they were ecstatic. They immediately set about lovingly preparing one of the upstairs rooms as a nursery. When the child was born, they were overjoyed, but their happiness was short-lived. The baby died in infancy. Unable to accept the tragedy, the couple preserved the baby's room exactly as it had been before the child's death. The result was a permanent eerie illusion, not only that the child was still alive, but impossibly perpetually an infant. It is not known whether the tragedy caused the woman to become a recluse, or whether she had always been an extremely introverted person. From today's perspective, it really doesn't make any difference. It is only important to note Shirley's explanation that from then on the house was her life. She had the place set up just so. She cleaned it from top to bottom. That was her domain. She had the ladies in for bridge occasionally, but that was about all. She rarely went out, Her husband was usually in the basement with his dog. Shirley said, "The couple retained the strictly regimented and self-sufficient order until his death more than 40 years later. Shortly afterwards, although she was loath to leave her beloved home, the widow moved to a nursing home. Evidently, the only way she could accept this removal was to think of it as a temporary accommodation to circumstances, and she made sure everyone at the nursing home was very clear about that too. She told all the ladies that looked after her in the nursing home that she was definitely going home," Shirley explained. Given this conviction, it was only reasonable that she wouldn't think of selling her home. She became somewhat unreasonable were the lengths to which the women went to support her fantasy. She actually paid people to keep the house clean, tidy, and stocked with provisions. This poignant and expensive fabrication went on until the woman's death more than 10 years later. The house was sold by the woman's estate. There were 2 young couples who lived there before we bought it. The couple we bought it from had similar experiences to ours, Shirley told me. Not long after they settled in, Shirley and her family realized they were not alone. It seemed that the elderly couple had never really left. Even more interesting was that the territorial division the pair had worked out for themselves in life was clearly continuing on well after their deaths. Shirley first sensed the woman's presence when she was working in an upstairs room, the room that she had formerly been the museum-like nursery. Seemingly, the previous owner was curious about what was now happening in the room that had once been a monument to her grief. Shirley said that realizing what she was dealing with made living and working in and around a haunted house somewhat less stressful. We took to talking to her, asking if what we were doing with the place was all right with her. She seemed to approve, and yet the whole time we were there, it was a real struggle, Shirley recalled. Nighttime was a particular challenge for the whole family. It was very noisy at night. There were unexplainable noises. Some nights the noises woke the family up. The next morning the kids would say, "Did you hear the scratching in the middle of the night last night?" Other nights I would wake up and sit up and look around for the people making the noise, but of course, no one was ever there. Sometimes you'd hear something that sounded like plastic flapping in the wind, but it was inside. Shirley explained before summarizing the disturbances as just a lot of going-ons. Family members were not the only ones who were aware of the presences in the house. People liked to go upstairs in the house and see how everything was decorated. The beds would be all made up, but often when there hadn't been anyone up there, there'd be impressions on the covers as though someone had been sitting on them. In the basement, the feeling was different, Shirley continued. I had worked myself into being spooked about going down there. You know that's the last load of laundry you should do late at night, but often I'd look down there and just couldn't bring myself to go down. Then one night I had a dream about him, the former owner. I dreamed that I went into the basement and he was standing there beside a steam boiler, but that he was a young man. I chatted with him, and after that I felt better about going into the basement. If he was there, I knew he was friendly. Shirley had commented to my contact in Thompson that she'd heard the husband had been a happy-go-lucky type of person, and that this attitude was then reflected in the atmosphere in the basement. Shirley explained that after having experienced the reassuring dream, the basement became a warm and dark and comfortable and friendly area of the house. This perception was a definite contrast to the previous feeling of being clucked at while she was on the other floors. Although Shirley attested that she had eventually reached an accommodation with the ghosts, her family decided to move on. She hasn't heard whether or not the new owners have had any unusual experiences, but readily admits that her desire to protect their identity might be somewhat futile. By now, they might be all too aware that they are living in a haunted house. This story takes place in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Waterford Ghost. Laurie Howard looks back fondly on the period of her life when she lived in a haunted house, and it's no wonder few associations, even with living people, are as heartwarming as Laurie's relationship was with the ghost in her house on Waterford Avenue. I enjoyed whispering about her and recounting our relationship, Laurie assured me. It's fortunate that the story did not turn out to be such a happy one, because the first signs that Laurie had when she moved into the house in 1974 were not tremendously positive. I would wake up in the night sweating like a pig. My night clothes would be damp from perspiration, and often I would be gasping for air. Other times, Laurie would wake up in the morning to find herself downstairs on the couch, unable to remember having moved from her bedroom. I found this so curious that I started looking for answers. This search must have been frustrating because Laurie soon surmised there seemed to be no logical answer. The window was only a single pane and seemed to be draughty all around it. There was only one heating vent in that room, and the temperature in the room was not individually controlled. So why did I feel like I was about to spontaneously combust every night in my sleep? The young woman asked rhetorically. She might never have suspected that her heating abnormalities had a paranormal origin, except that her belongings began moving around mysteriously. I was truly puzzled, she confessed. Little did she know that her confusion had barely begun. One day I was sitting on the mattress reading. I could actually feel the temperature rising in the room. I took off my sweatshirt and threw it on the table. While I was reading, I could sense some movement. I looked up to see my sweatshirt hit the floor. The room was absolutely stifling. I got up and folded the shirt and put it right in the middle of the table, Laurie stressed. She had been willing to entertain the possibility that when she'd thrown the shirt on the table, it might have landed in such a way that it could have slipped off. I went to the washroom and washed my face to cool down. When I went back into the bedroom, it was like walking into an oven, and there was my shirt back on the floor. By now the heat in Laurie's bedroom was so intense that it was making her feel ill. As Laurie expressed it, this was a typical Peg winter day. There was no reason that this draughty room to be so hot. The heat was not coming through the register at this moment. I walked around the house and every room felt comfortable with a sweater on. What was going on, Laurie wondered, and added, I wasn't scared, but I did feel something strange, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Laurie Howard was clearly a pragmatic young woman, for she set about trying to assure herself there was a reasonable physical explanation for at least some of her strange experiences. I went down to the basement and got the level out of the toolbox. She was hoping to prove to herself that her sweatshirt had slid off the table in her bedroom because the tabletop surface was uneven. Unfortunately for Laurie's peace of mind at the time, her experiment failed to prove her point. When I placed the level on the table, the bubble floated dead at center. The table was level. Under other circumstances, it might have pleased someone to discover that the house they were living in had no obvious sags, and that their table stood level. In this case, however, the normally good news did not bring her the reassurance that it could have, and so she tested further. I got a marble and put it in various places on the table. Much to my chagrin, it would not roll off. The scientific side of Laurie's mind simply couldn't accept any explanation other than the force of gravity being responsible for her sweatshirt, twice falling onto the floor. Thoroughly intrigued by what was going on in her bedroom, Laurie went a step further by littering the top of the table from which her shirt had fallen with an ashtray, a bar of oatmeal soap, a glass of water, and an impatience plant. Next, Laurie carefully noted the objects and their locations on the table before heading out to the store to buy a room thermometer. I practically raced up the stairs when I got home, and there on the floor, just outside the bathroom door, was the bar of oatmeal soap. Now, a woman of lesser courage would have looked for alternate accommodation, but not Laurie. I felt spooked, but not enough to turn and flee. I was strongly drawn to figure out what exactly was going on. Laurie was interested to note that although the soap was the only item from the table that was no longer in her bedroom, all the items had been moved. All that is except plant. I put my watch back in the ashtray and put the ashtray back where I had originally placed it. The book on the floor and the glass of water was at the back of the table. I watered the plant with the water from the glass and put the glass back on the table. Once again, I could feel the room getting warmer by the minute. I ignored it for a while. I could feel my face getting flushed and my hands were getting clammy. By now, even logical Laurie had to admit something very out of the ordinary was going on. I got up just as the empty glass hit the floor. This crash startled her enough that she decided it was time to check the recently purchased thermometer. I was sure that it would be in the 80s, but it read 65 degrees Fahrenheit. When I turned back to the table, I noticed the ashtray was on its side and my watch was dumped out. The calm, calculating side of Laurie's nature had finally reached its end. Beads of perspiration were forming on my forehead. I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't tell people that I thought there was a ghost in my bedroom. They would think I was nuts, Laurie realized. What would it prove anyway? Little changed for Laurie for a time, and slowly she began to accept that she'd likely never find a physical cause for her bizarre living conditions. She continued to wake up in her living room when she'd gone to sleep in her bedroom, and things that she placed on the table in her bedroom continued to be moved about, with one exception, the impatiens plant. It was thriving and its position never changed. I never moved it either, almost out of respect for whomever it was that I seemed to be annoying. After a while, Laurie and her invisible but mischievous roommate began to cohabit reasonably peacefully. By the time winter was finally over and spring had arrived, the woman decided to treat herself to a holiday. After making arrangements to have a friend pick up her mail while she was gone, Laurie left on vacation. I didn't leave the key because I didn't think there was any need to. I had shut the water off and everything, she explained. At some point during her time away, Laurie suddenly remembered the impatiens plant. It was sure to die from neglect during her absence. I felt bad, like I had let her down, as though she was responding to the sudden use of gender in her description of the ghostly presence. Laurie added the ghost had now become a woman in my mind and had somehow worked her way into my heart. Now this comment is especially interesting because Laurie had no way of knowing anything about the former owner of the house. She was only subletting the place from friends. Even so, however, it was obvious that long ago someone had lovingly cared for the grounds around the house. The overgrown remains of flower and vegetable gardens were barely discernible now, but at one time they were probably the pride and joy of a dedicated gardener. Wildflowers from stray seeds poked out of cracks in the driveway and foundation. The trees attested to the age of their surroundings and lent not only shade but an aura of peace and tranquility. Laurie also added that the house no longer compared well with its neighbors. The house stood out from all the others on the block as it was dilapidated. Presuming the ghost was the former owner of the house and someone who kept the place up, Laurie commented that she felt sorry for the ghost and therefore terribly guilty that the impatiens plant, the one positive connection she had to the spirit of the former owner, would have died because of Laurie's own lack of forethought. The young woman returned from vacation expecting the worst. As she explained, anyone who has ever had an impatiens plant would know they need lots of water and tending. So when I returned home, you could imagine my surprise when I saw the healthiest looking plant in my entire life. Laurie knew immediately that something out of the ordinary had not only kept the plant alive, but actually caused it to flourish. It was not physically possible as I looked at the plant. I had tears streaming down my cheeks and I was laughing out loud. The plant was overflowing its container and was covered in beautiful pink blossoms, Laurie said. I stuck my finger into the soil and it was bone dry. By way of thanking her invisible horticulturist, Laurie set to work in the yard. I spent the next week in the backyard restoring the gardens. I planted some vegetables and put in numerous flats of bedding plants. I transplanted the impatiens plant to a hanging basket and hung it in a tree that could easily be seen from the bedroom window. I left a small slip of the plant out and planted the slip in a small pot and put it back on the table in the bedroom. Within hours of Laurie's kind attention to the property was rewarded. That night, I awoke to felt a presence in the room. The room was not hot for a change. I was actually comfortable. Having awakened up so many nights from the intense heat in the room, and feeling only a normal air temperature now, Laurie wondered what had wakened her out of a sound sleep. Then I saw her. She was very old, with white hair wrapped in a neat bun. She had a very plain black dress with a flower-printed apron over it. She was looking out the window and smiling. As fast as the apparition had appeared, she faded and disappeared. I was sitting bolt upright and I had tears in my eyes. Her smiling face had deeply touched my heart. That instance created a definite bond between the home's current occupant and presumably a former one that lasted happily until the day Laurie moved out. This story takes place in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Some people are more haunted than others. Occasionally the way a ghost story reaches me is almost as intriguing as the story itself. The following tale fits securely into that category. W. Ritchie Benedict, a paranormal researcher in Calgary, Alberta, was among the many who were aware of my hunt for Manitoba ghost stories. When he spotted an appropriate article in the British magazine Phoenix, he sent it along to me. Not content with merely re-reporting this terrific story, I wrote to Alan Baker, editor of the Phoenix, asking for more information. Just a few weeks later, 2 envelopes arrived in the mail for me. The larger of the 2 was from the United Kingdom, and inside I discovered additional issues of Baker's magazine, both containing reports of hauntings in Manitoba and both written by a woman named Nancy Bennett. While still basking in the excitement of that coup, I noticed the second envelope had come from Victoria, British Columbia. More specifically from Nancy Bennett, of that beautiful western capital. She wanted to let me know that Alan Baker had contacted her regarding my inquiry, and that she was most anxious to help in any way she could. And so, with my thanks to Mr. Benedict, Mr. Baker, and especially to Nancy Bennett, who kindly agreed to let me use the stories. Here is a series of Manitoba ghost stories, all sharing a central character, a woman named Alana. Nancy Bennett began by explaining what all of us who collect anecdotes about phantoms soon discover. Some people are more likely to have an experience with a presence than others are. Certain people share the same wavelength as spirits, and therefore receive their messages much more readily than others. This ability seems to be naturally occurring, but from all I've been told, it would appear that you can either hone or suppress the talent, depending on your interest and comfort level. For Alana, it was evidenced right from childhood that she was one of those people who possess an inherent awareness of the spirit world. She shared the ability with her mother, who was also able to see and sense spirits. Alana's first remembered experience occurred when she was less than 10 years of age. She had traveled with her family some distance to visit friends. The length of the journey was such that visiting the family was invited to spend the night with its host. Alana and her brother were exhausted from the trip, and so were put to bed early in adjoining bedrooms. The children fell asleep quickly. Both children would probably have slept right through the night, but were jolted awake by the sudden sensation that they were not alone in their rooms. Alana opened her eyes to gaze upon a gleaming white form. The apparition wore a bridal gown that glowed and seemed to float about the ethereal body that wore it. Alana was so fascinated by the surreal dress that it took her a moment to realize there was something even more distressing about the presence in her room. The bride was headless. The little girl ran from the room in search of her brother. She found the lad in the hall. He was heading for the comfort of her bedroom because he was equally as frightened by something he'd seen. A disembodied woman's head floating about his temporary bedroom. As the 2 children huddled together and exchanged their incredible stories, they both calmed considerably and were able to report the details of their sightings to one another. The head that the little boy saw must have belonged to the ghostly body that had visited Alana, for he declared that it had been wearing a white veil. Little did Alana know then that the headless apparition would prove to be merely the first in a lifetime dotted with paranormal observations. When the family moved into a home on McGregor Street in Winnipeg, Alana reported she felt very ill at ease in the house. They'd only lived there a short time when her mother began to see an image, that of a man wearing a red and black jacket. The apparition, which was crouched in the corner near the staircase to the basement, exuded such overwhelming sadness that it soon began to affect the older woman. She'd become convinced that the man whose spirits peered out at her from beyond had come to an unnatural end in this house. The woman began to look for clues that would substantiate her claim. She searched the attic of the house and was rewarded almost immediately, for there in the dust lay what remained of a red and black jacket. It was old and torn, but still distinctive enough that the woman recognized it as being the jacket the ghost wore. Closer examination revealed a definite hole in the material, a hole that was surrounded by a blood-like stain. The apparition's appearances increased dramatically after the jacket was found, and so Alana's mother widened her search to include the home's unfinished basement. The area was considerably less than appealing, one the family had only used for storage. The cellar floor was bare earth and extended into a crawl space that had been blocked by barrels. Taking Alana with her, the determined mother made her way into the previously barricaded space. The moment their eyes adjusted to the darkness, mother and daughter saw a sight they'll never forget: 2 mounds of earth. They were the shape of graves, Alana attested simply. Too frightened to continue their search, the two left their discovery for Alana's skeptical sister to investigate further. Laughing at her mother's and sister's fear, the youngster crept through the passage. Initially, the second daughter must have thought she'd made a terrific find. The only article she unearthed from one of the mounds appeared to be a piece of gold. She happily showed it to her father, who immediately dashed the child's hope by declaring the nugget to be a worthless chunk of fool's gold. Even though no one in Alana's family was anxious to move again, they'd all had more than enough of life in a haunted house. While making the necessary arrangements and waiting to move, they made a point of avoiding the eerie basement. They moved from the haunted house without ever having investigated the second mound of dirt in the basement. Whatever they might have unearthed there could have explained why the house was haunted. Today, we're left to wonder: was a body buried there? Did someone get away with murder? Is the house still standing? Has the basement been fully excavated? Is the old place on McGregor Street still haunted, or has the tormented soul finally found eternal peace? Years passed, and Alana met the man she would eventually marry. While on a date, the couple drove to a nearby lake. All the locals, Alana and her friend included, were aware that there was an endearing legend associated with the area around this particular lake. It was said that some years ago, a couple decided to indulge themselves in a relaxing holiday and rented a cabin by the lake. One evening, the wife wanted to go for a walk, but could not convince her husband to join her. His decision turned out to have been a tragic one, for he never saw his wife alive again. When the woman didn't return within what her husband thought was a reasonable length of time, he set out to look for her. She hadn't gotten far. Someone must have been watching the cabin, and as soon as she was a distance from the safety of that little dwelling, had raped and murdered her. The husband, apparently completely overcome with grief, killed himself by walking purposely into the lake. Since that day, it was said on the anniversary of the couple's death, their apparitions could be seen. Over the years, watching for the paranormal activity has become a popular pastime, especially when the young people in the nearby community. The reports were all the same and quite specific. Lights moved slowly from one room of the cabin into another, as if someone were carrying a candle. Shadows of 2 people could sometimes be seen. While all of that might have been enough to have sparked interest in the thrill-seeking teens, but Alana was different. She understood the essence of an actual sighting because of her childhood experiences. As Nancy Bennett put it, Alana was not about to be fooled by the charade. Feeling she had her fill of adolescence histrionics, Alana suggested to her boyfriend that they drive back to town. And that's when they saw it, the sight neither can ever forget. Up along the tree line, a man and a woman were walking hand in hand. They were stepping on air as if they went along the forest top, walking silently. The night, which had been alive with sounds, was suddenly plunged with a vicious silence. Alana had recounted to Nancy Bennett. Alana had had enough. She turned and hightailed it back to the car. Neither the young woman nor her husband-to-be ever visited the area again. They married not long afterwards, and as planned, began a family almost immediately. As with many newlyweds, finances were a problem. Their furnishings were decidedly sparse, so when an acquaintance offered to give them a chair for their living room, they were happy to accept the gift. At the time, of course, they had no way of knowing that this particular gift brought along more than what was always visible. As any woman who has ever been in the later stages of pregnancy can attest, sleeping through the night is not a luxury available during the weeks immediately prior to giving birth. Alana was no exception. One night during a trip to the washroom, the woman was anxious to see a man, dressed only in a well-worn housecoat, sitting on the newly received living room chair. The apparition might have been as surprised to see Alana as she was to see him, for he stared intently at her. Alana's reaction was considerably louder than that. She screamed. The man shook his head in disapproval before fading from sight. The sightings of the man in the chair continued until Alana could not take the strain any longer. She made plans to give the chair away, reasoning that if the chair was not in the house would not be haunted. Alana's mother, who had always admired the chair, offered to take it. She thought it would look nice in her own daughter's bedroom. Well, it might have looked very nice, but as soon as the chair was placed in her room, Alana's sister began to have nightmares. They were very specific nightmares, where she saw the image of a man in a housecoat sitting on the chair. After each dream, she would awaken with a start, and for just a second, actually see the same image that had unnerved her sister so. Desperate for peace, the family disposed of the chair. That thankfully put a stop to the terrifying dreams and the sightings. It does not, however, explain where the spirit of the man could be now. This story takes place in Winnipeg, Manitoba, the Old Geezer. The following story certainly supports the theory that children are more sensitive to the other realm than adults are. Susan, a Winnipeg resident, explained that during the 1970s, when she was 10 years old, her parents purchased a home in the north end of Winnipeg. It had been built in 1926, and so already had a lengthy history, unknown, of course, to Susan's family. Upon entering the house, I immediately felt uneasy, verbalized dislike for the house, and was told it would look differently after it was painted. While I was in bed the first night, I came to the conclusion that the house was haunted. 29 years later, we all know the house is haunted. Susan's family gave the presence a name of sorts, as many people with extraordinary companions do. When they didn't refer to him as the man, it was the Old Geezer. Susan knows her family had the gender correct, for she actually saw the apparition. As a teenager, I remember sitting in the living room late at night, watching TV. My parents' room is right off the living room, so I sat on the floor in front of the TV with the volume low. All the lights in the house were out. Suddenly, I felt as if I were being watched. It was one of those moments when you feel those wee hairs at the back of your neck stand straight up. I turned quickly, and there in the hall stood an old man. Any ghost sighting is an extraordinary experience, but the details Susan discerned make this report especially dramatic. His image was made entirely of speckled and dispersed light. Clad in what I believed to be a hat and suit jacket length coat, he stood looking my way. Moments later, he moved from the hall into my bedroom. The youngster was understandably unnerved and remembers feeling angry that her parents had not listened more closely to her concerns when they were deciding whether to buy the house. Throughout her adolescence, Susan continued to be aware of the apparition's presence in the family home. In 1981, after living on her own successfully for a number of years, Susan returned to live in her parents' home to complete her education and realize her dream of becoming a nurse. Not long after she moved back into the house, the ghost recognized her return to his domain, Susan explained. I returned home one afternoon just in time to make an important call. With about 3 minutes to spare, I ran to my room, shut the door, sat on the bed, and picked up the phone. As I began to dial, the door to the room opened and then slammed shut. It did this repeatedly until the clock passed 5 p.m., and there was no point in completing the call. During the few minutes the door slamming occurred, I called out angry, "Tim, stop it," thinking that my brother, 8 years my junior, was playing a prank. The door was located no more than 3 feet from where I was sitting, and I bolted up and through the doorway to discover no one was there. I proceeded up the stairs and I stood in front of the TV, yelling and accusing Tim of making me miss a very important call. My father said, "You don't know what you're talking about. He's been in your mother's room for the last half hour, blow-drying his hair." A quick glance into her parents' room confirmed the older man's words. That incident, however, marked the beginning of a series of events that the family will never forget. Both Susan and her brother, then 15 years of age, occupied bedrooms in the basement of the house. Teenage boys often aren't too particular about housekeeping, and Tim was no exception. Susan described her brother's small bedroom as usually being a total disaster. One evening, with a lot of persuasion, he cleaned, polished, and vacuumed his room. He had a set of weights which he stacked neatly in the corner of the room. With great pride, he showed me what he had done, and soon after, everyone retired. Shortly after 1 a.m., I was awakened by what I thought was an explosion. With horror, my first thought was that the furnace blew up. It was located under the stairs, and I feared Tim and I were trapped. I bolted out the door and turned on the light. The furnace was fine. I went up the stairs and checked my other brother's room and my parents' room. Everyone slept soundly. I went back to my room wondering what was going on. Not knowing what else to do, Susan went back to bed, telling herself she had been dreaming. Seconds later, a pale and badly shaken Tim opened Susan's bedroom door. The boy swore softly under his breath when his sister asked him what was wrong. "Didn't you hear that big noise?" he asked incredulously. Susan assured Tim that she had. Before she could explain that she had already checked the entire house and that all was well, the youngster motioned for her to come with him. We went to the door of his room, which now looked as if a tornado had gone through. Papers, clothing, and furniture were everywhere. The set of weights was on his bed, Susan related. She noticed her brother was rubbing his head. The lad explained, "My weights hit me on the head while I was sleeping." Tim was terrified, and frankly so was I. He slept on the foot of my bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, the pair spoke to their mother about the incident. They pleaded with her to get a priest to visit. She refused, but perhaps later regretted it when the next night she was the target of the old geezer's explosive activity. Susan's father was away on business that night, and the rest of the family had gone to bed when they heard an explosion similar to the one of the night before. For the second night in a row, Susan raced upstairs to investigate the sound. My mother's door was open, and she was sitting upright in bed, cursing up a storm. Her bedroom door had been thrown open with such extreme force that it had moved the dresser behind it, Susan remembered. She added ironically that for someone who didn't acknowledge the existence of the presence, Her mother certainly told something or someone off in no uncertain terms. My mother proceeded to say that she was paying the mortgage and that whoever he was should go away and get the hell out of her house. For a few minutes, the frightened little group attempted to reassure one another before Susan's mother pulled rank and commanded we all go to sleep. Not surprisingly, very little sleep was to be had in that once quiet household in the north end of Winnipeg. The experience, however, did force Susan's mother to admit that she too had seen the ghost. Animals often act as though they see something that their owners don't, and the family dog was no exception. I cannot tell you the number of times she jumped off the bed barking at nothing. Often awakened by this, I didn't know whether to curse at what I couldn't see or to smack the dog. I often did both, Susan said. The strain of living with a ghost can take its toll on a family. To retain at least some harmony, people often find humor in the bizarre circumstances. So it was with Susan's family. One afternoon, in typical teenage brother fashion, Tim and his best friend Ricky sneaked into Susan's bedroom while she was out. Unaware that his friend's house had a resident ghost, the visitors stared in horror as the closet door in Susan's room began to open and close, apparently by itself. To this day, Ricky will not go down into the basement, Susan added. Despite the obvious drawbacks of living in a haunted house, the family stayed on. Not everyone has experienced the paranormal border. Neither Susan's father nor her older brother Dan has ever encountered anything untowards in the family's home. 10 years ago, Susan married a man who she claims was one of the world's biggest skeptics. Early last spring, Susan and her husband offered to help repaint the inside of her parents' home. It was mid-afternoon, and as I sounded the wall, I got a very strange feeling. I turned to see the ghost standing not 3 feet behind my husband. I turned away quickly, and when I looked back, he was gone. I got a quick and strong case of the chills, followed by a very bad case of the giggles. I told my husband he was standing just behind him. My husband looked at me, shook his head, and kept on painting. Truly, some people are more closely attuned to the frequency phantoms are on. Despite the fact that Susan's husband painted through the close encounter with his in-law's resident spook, not all of those who have married into this haunted family have been free of experiences. In the intervening years, Tim married, and at one point, he and his wife, Audra, decided to move into the basement of Tim's parents' house. When Susan heard of their plans, she reminded them he's not going to like it. It appears that I was correct, Susan continued. Mid-September, while in the recreation room, Audra met the man. She told us that he suddenly appeared and actually blocked out the sun, which came in the window. He then approached her and touched her arm. Susan added, somewhat redundantly, this was not a pleasant experience. Despite all the activity throughout the years, the family has stayed on, sharing their home with an unpleasant and sometimes downright frightening ghost for 30 years. In 10 months, it'll be our 30th anniversary in that house, Susan said. It has truly become our family home, Alabette, a family home with a little extra. The old man has scared us beyond disbelief, yet made us laugh at times. He is definitely a part of our memories past, present, and probably future.